The silence in Ji-hoon's world was a manufactured thing. It was the kind of silence that only absolute power could buy, built on the unspoken understanding that when the head of the Park family entered a room, the rest of the world was meant to hold its breath. He was 34, and for the last 10 years, he had ruthlessly expanded his family's syndicate behind the flawless, impenetrable shield of a global real estate empire. He was a man of cold marble and sharp edges, moving through life with a calculated distance that kept everyone exactly where he wanted them, beneath him. But there was one room in the city where his power meant nothing. The air in his grandmother's bedroom was heavy with the scent of jasmine and the quiet, steady hum of medical equipment. Halmioni was the only softness Ji-hoon, or Ryu as the streets and boardrooms knew him, had ever known. She had raised him when the syndicate had swallowed his parents whole, shielding him from the brutality of their legacy for as long as she could. Now, her time was slipping away, her once steady hands frail as they rested against the heavy blankets. Ryu sat beside her, his posture rigid, the weight of his empire left at the door. He had offered her everything, the best specialists in the world, private wings and luxury hospitals, anything his vast wealth could procure. She had refused it all with a gentle, stubborn shake of her head. She only had one request, and it had nothing to do with medicine or money. She wanted the old glass greenhouse in the backyard of her original Brooklyn home restored. It was the house she had lived in before the family gathered its massive wealth, the greenhouse her late husband had built for her piece by piece. Over the decades, it had fallen into complete ruin. The iron had rusted, the glass had shattered, and nature had violently reclaimed the space. Ryu had immediately reached for his phone to dispatch a fleet of the city's most expensive contractors to build her a masterpiece. But her hand had reached out, resting over his. She didn't want a fleet of strangers. She wanted him to do it. She wanted his hands in the dirt, his sweat on the iron. She wanted him to remember what it felt like to build something from the ground up, with patience and care, rather than simply conquering it. It was her dying wish, a desperate attempt to tether her grandson's soul to something real before she left him alone in a world of predators. And so, Ryu found himself standing in the overgrown, suffocating heat of a Brooklyn backyard on a Tuesday morning. The air was thick, the humidity pressing against his skin as he stared at the skeletal remains of the greenhouse. It was a chaotic mess of shattered panes and creeping vines. He felt entirely out of his element, a king stripped of his court, staring at a problem that could not be solved by intimidation or a wire transfer. He was not entirely alone, however. Halmioni had insisted on hiring a structural engineer to guide the restoration, someone who understood the historic integrity of the ironwork. Ryu had expected a quiet, deferential academic who would quickly realize who he was and stay out of his way. Instead, he got Maya. Ryu heard her before he saw her, a deep, rich laugh that carried through the humid air, followed by the heavy, confident crunch of work boots stepping over broken glass. She emerged from the overgrown foliage like a force of nature. Maya was a beautifully plus-sized woman who took up space with a radiant, unapologetic power, her dark skin glowing lightly with the morning heat. There was no hesitation in her movements, no shrinking to accommodate the heavy, intimidating aura that Ryu naturally projected. People usually made themselves small around him. They lowered their voices, averted their eyes, and folded their shoulders. Maya did none of that. She walked right up to him, a clipboard tucked under one arm, her gaze sweeping over him with an analytical, completely unimpressed focus. She didn't care about his rigid posture or the icy glare that usually sent his lieutenants running. To her, he was just a grandson fulfilling a promise. "You must be Ji-hoon," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an undeniable authority. She extended a hand. "I'm Maya. I drew up the structural plans for the restoration." Ryu looked at her hand for a fraction of a second too long before taking it. Her grip was firm, warm, and calloused from years of real work. It was not the soft, manicured handshake of the people in his world. "I am," he said, his voice dropping into the low, clipped cadence he used to establish control. My grandmother gave me your credentials. I expect this to be done efficiently. I do not have time to waste here. Maya didn't flinch. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face, completely neutralizing his coldness. Well, Ji-hoon, she said, pulling her hand back and turning toward the ruined greenhouse. Nature really doesn't care about your schedule. Neither does rusted iron. This is going to take exactly as much time as it requires to be done right. She turned back to face him, her eyes locking onto his with a bold, steady warmth that made something deep inside his chest tighten. Your money paid for the materials, she added, her voice dropping into a softer yet firmer register. But out here, you're the labor, and out here, I'm the boss. For the first time in a decade, Ryu was speechless. A flash of irritation sparked in his jaw, but it was immediately swallowed by something else, something entirely unfamiliar. He watched her as she moved toward a pile of salvaged iron beams, her body moving with a fluid, grounded grace. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't afraid of him. She picked up a heavy pair of work gloves and tossed them through the air. Ryu caught them entirely on reflex. "Let's get to work, tough guy," she called out over her shoulder, already assessing the first fallen beam. "We have a foundation to clear." The first few weeks were a battle of wills. Ryu was stubborn, accustomed to giving orders and having the world bend to his exact specifications. He approached the physical labor with a rigid, punishing intensity, trying to conquer the rusted greenhouse the way he conquered rival businesses. But Maya was relentless in her pacing. She would stop him when he weshed, her voice cutting through the heavy summer air, forcing him to slow down, to align the iron properly, to understand the weight of the glass before trying to set it. And slowly, the ice began to melt. Ryu found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. He watched the way she solved problems, her brilliant mind calculating load-bearing weights and structural tensions with effortless ease. He noticed the way she interacted with the neighborhood, the way the local deli owner knew her order by heart, the way kids on the street waved to her. She was a woman deeply connected to the world around her, vibrating with a life force that Ryu had spent his entire adulthood actively avoiding. She was vibrant. She was loud when she was happy, her laughter a melody he started wanting to earn. She was comfortable in her own skin in a way that left him in silent awe. In Ryu's world, women were curated. They were thin, silent, and presented as strategic assets. They existed in the margins of the men who possessed them. Maya was the center of her own universe. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the Brooklyn skyline, casting a golden hue over the half-finished greenhouse, a sudden, violent summer storm rolled in. The sky bruised purple and black, and the rain came down in absolute sheets. They scrambled into the center of the structure, taking cover under the section of the glass roof they had managed to secure that morning. The space was tight, the sound of the rain deafening as it hammered against the new glass. Ryu found himself standing inches from her, her shoulders almost brushing. The air shifted. The tension of the labor bled away, replaced by a sudden electric closeness. Water dripped from her hair, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath, a wide, genuine smile lighting up her face. "Well," she laughed, the sound lower and softer now over the roar of the rain. "I'd say the seal on those panels is holding up." Ryu didn't look at the panels. He was looking at her. He realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that he hadn't thought about the syndicate, his enemies, or his empire all day. He had only thought about the way her mind worked, the way her presence made him feel human. "It's holding," he murmured, his voice dropping, his eyes tracing the soft curve of her jaw, the fullness of her lips. Maya looked up at him, the laughter fading from her expression, replaced by a quiet, breathless realization. The distance between them was entirely gone. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. He had spent his life building fortresses, keeping everyone out, ensuring his own survival through isolation and fear. But standing there in the rain, looking at this brilliant, beautiful woman who demanded nothing but the truth from him, Ryu realized he wanted to let the walls fall. He reached out, his hand, usually an instrument of command, moving with agonizing gentleness as he brushed a damp curl away from her face. Maya's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. Her dark eyes searched his, looking past the cold exterior he showed the world, finding the man his grandmother had hoped she could save. The space between them vanished. Ryu didn't think, he simply moved, driven by a gravity he had never experienced. When his lips met hers, the roar of the rain pounding against the glass roof seemed to fade into a distant hum. Maya tasted of summer rain and sweet coffee, and the way she responded, leaning into him, her hands coming up to rest warm and solid against his chest, ignited a fire in his blood that threatened to consume him entirely. He kissed her with the desperate, starving intensity of a man who had been wandering in the dark his entire life and had finally found a source of light. Maya's fingers tangled in his damp hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him. For Ryu, a man whose entire existence was built on calculating his next move, there was no strategy here. There was only Maya. When they finally broke apart, breathless and lingering in the quiet aftermath of the storm, the world had fundamentally shifted. From that afternoon on, the restoration of the greenhouse became the backdrop to a sweeping, all-consuming romance. As they laid the final stones and planted the orchids his grandmother loved, Ryu methodically dismantled the walls he had built around his heart. He didn't tell her everything, he couldn't. To Maya, Ji-hoon was a fiercely private, intensely driven corporate real estate developer. He spoke of acquisitions and zoning laws, omitting the violence and shadow play of the syndicate that truly funded his empire. He convinced himself that he was protecting her, compartmentalizing the darkness so that it could never touch the pure, radiant thing they were building together. Once the greenhouse was finished, Ryu brought Maya into his world. He swept her off her feet with a ferocity that left her breathless. There were late-night dinners in empty five-star restaurants where he had bought out the entire floor just so he could listen to her laugh without interruption. There were sudden weekend flights to private coastal estates where they would spend days tangled in high thread count sheets, isolated from the noise of the city. But it wasn't the wealth that won Maya over, it was the way he looked at her. Maya had spent her life navigating a world that constantly tried to make her feel like she took up too much space. Society, her industry, the passing glances of strangers, they all carried the unspoken demand that she shrink. Ryu demanded the exact opposite. He worshipped her. He treated her presence like a privilege he had to earn. In the quiet, intimate hours of the night, he would trace the curves of her body with a reverence that bordered on the holy. When she would occasionally hesitate, a lingering ghost of old insecurities whispering that she didn't fit into the sleek, manicured aesthetic of his high society life, Ryu would silence it instantly. "Look at them," he murmured one evening, standing behind her on a balcony overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, his arms wrapped securely around her waist. He pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck, his voice a low, steady rumble against her skin. "The people in those towers, they spend their lives starving themselves, hollowing themselves out to fit into molds built by people who hate them. They are fragile. They are glass." He turned her around to face him, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "You are the foundation, Maya. You are the only real thing in this entire city. Do not ever shrink for them. Let them make room for you." Under his absolute adoration, Maya blossomed. She felt entirely seen, loved not in spite of her fullness, but because of it. Her mind, her laughter, her body. Ryu consumed it all like a starving man, and she gave herself to him completely. The peak of their golden era arrived in the very place it had begun. A year after they met, Ryu brought her back to the Brooklyn house. The greenhouse was now a thriving, lush sanctuary of blooming orchids and rich greenery. Halmione was there, sitting in a velvet chair, her frail face lit with a deep, peaceful joy. She had known from the very first day what Maya would mean to her grandson. She reached out, taking Maya's hand and pressing it to her cheek, giving her silent, tearful blessing. When Halmione was guided back inside to rest, Ryu turned to Maya among the blooming flowers. The intimidating, untouchable CEO vanished. In his place was just a man, profoundly in love, dropping to one knee on the damp earth. He didn't offer a rehearsed speech. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with a vulnerable, desperate hope. "I have lived my entire life in the cold." He held up a ring that caught the sunlight filtering through the glass they had built together. "Be my warmth, Maya. Build a life with me." Maya wept, pulling him up from the dirt and into her arms, pressing her answer against his lips. Their wedding was a private, deeply intimate affair. They bypassed the grand society spectacles Ryu's board expected and married on a quiet stretch of coastline. Maya felt like she was living in a dream. She had found a partner who matched her strength, who celebrated her power, and who loved her with a fierce, protective loyalty. For the first few months of their marriage, the bubble held. They were a unified front, deeply entwined and fiercely happy. Maya began to take on larger, more ambitious architectural projects, her confidence soaring, fueled by the sanctuary of love she returned to every night. But a bubble is, by its very nature, fragile. Ryu had built his marriage on a foundation of omissions. He had kept the syndicate completely hidden from her, acting as a shield against the violent, ruthless realities of the Park family legacy. He thought he could keep the two worlds separated forever. He thought his love for her was strong enough to hold back the tide. He was wrong. The first crack in the glass did not come from an enemy. It came from a private jet touching down at JFK Airport on a freezing November morning. Madam Park had arrived in New York. Madam Park did not enter a room. She consumed its oxygen. When she walked into the sprawling Manhattan penthouse Ryu and Maya shared, the temperature seemed to immediately drop. She was a woman carved from the very ice her grandson had spent the last year trying to thaw. For decades, she had operated as the silent, ruthless architect of the Park Syndicate, holding the family's power structures together with an iron grip. When she met Maya, there were no raised voices, there was no outward hostility. Madam Park simply looked at her new daughter-in-law with the terrifying, polite calculation of an auditor assessing a bad investment. She saw a woman who was entirely too bold, too warm, and too far outside the rigid aristocratic beauty standards of her elite circle. She saw a woman who took up space in a world that demanded women be decorative and silent. "You are very present," Madam Park said over a tense, stifling dinner, her eyes sweeping over Maya's full figure before taking a slow sip of her tea. "In our culture, the wife of a powerful man learns the art of being a shadow, a quiet foundation. But you prefer the spotlight." Maya had smiled, responding with her usual confident grace, defending her career and her partnership with Ryu. She looked to her husband, fully expecting the man who had worshipped her on his knees to defend her. But Ryu said nothing. He stared rigidly at his plate, his jaw tight. The silence was the first fracture in the foundation. Behind closed doors, the reality of Madam Park's visit came crashing down on Ryu. The syndicate was bleeding. A sweeping federal probe had frozen key assets, and rival families were circling, smelling blood in the water. Ryu's legitimate real estate empire, his shield, was on the verge of total collapse. If the business fell, the syndicate's creditors would not take him to court. They would take his life. His mother held the keys to his survival. She possessed the old world political connections and offshore capital necessary to keep the wolves at bay. But she had an ultimatum: To secure the backing of their highly traditional, deeply conservative overseas investors, Ryu had to present a flawless, conventional image of control. He could not look like a man distracted by a rebellious, unconventional American wife. They look at you, and they see a man who cannot even control his own household, his mother hissed in their private study, her voice a venomous whisper. She is a liability. She is loud, she is improper, and she is an embarrassment to our pedigree. If you want my network to save your life, you will remind her of her place. You will fall in line. Ryu was trapped. The suffocating weight of the syndicate, a life he had tried to keep hidden from Maya, descended upon him entirely. Fear is a corrosive thing, and under the crushing pressure of losing his empire and his life, Ryu's spine snapped. Instead of fighting the darkness of his world, he allowed it to swallow him, and worst of all, he brought it into his home. The rot started slowly. It began with the events. Ryu stopped asking Maya to accompany him to corporate galas and investor dinners, citing that the crowds would be too stuffy for her. When she insisted on supporting him, noting the bags forming under his eyes from stress, his rejections grew sharper. He told her laughter was too loud for these rooms, that she needed to temper her personality. Then the physical distance crept in. The man who used to trace her skin with reverence now rolled over in bed, his back facing her, rigid and untouchable. The late-night conversations disappeared, replaced by the glow of his laptop and the clinking of whiskey glasses in his study. Maya tried to reach him. She poured her heart out, asking him what was wrong, begging him to let her shoulder the burden with him. She didn't know about the syndicate, only that his real estate company was struggling. But every time she offered her warmth, Ryu, terrified by his own weakness and cornered by his mother's demands, pushed her away with increasing cruelty. He needed to feel powerful, and to do that, he began to dismantle the most powerful thing in his life. The subtle critiques escalated into open contempt. He started weaponizing her body, the very body he used to call a masterpiece. When she got ready for a rare evening out with him, feeling the heavy strain between them, and hoping to remind him of the woman he fell in love with, he stood in the doorway of their bedroom and looked at her with hollow, critical eyes. "You're not actually going out in that, are you?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Maya froze. Her hands dropped to her sides. "I used to love how I looked in this." "I was blind," he snapped, the stress of the syndicate bleeding into his tone, transforming him into a mirror of his mother. "Look at yourself, Maya. You take up entirely too much room. You draw all the wrong kinds of attention. My investors don't want to look at a woman who clearly has no discipline over herself. You're an embarrassment to our pedigree." The words struck her like physical blows. Maya stood there, the air knocked out of her lungs, staring at the stranger wearing her husband's face. He didn't apologize. He simply turned and walked down the hall, leaving her alone in the quiet, echoing bedroom. Over the next year, the penthouse became a beautifully decorated hell. Ryu systematically tore down her self-esteem, projecting all his failures and fears on her size, her presence, her very existence. He made her feel grotesque. He made her feel unworthy of the air she breathed. Every argument ended with him pointing out her flaws, convincing her she was lucky he hadn't abandoned her, that no one else in his high society world would ever accept a woman like her. And slowly, tragically, the vibrant, radiant architect who commanded a Brooklyn construction site began to shrink. Maya stopped laughing. She stopped sharing her ideas. She spent her evenings sitting on the cold bathroom tiles, wrapping her arms around her knees, weeping silently so she wouldn't disturb the man sleeping in the guest room. She believed him. She believed the rot was her fault. She had made herself entirely small, trying desperately to fit into a world that was actively trying to crush her. The silence of the penthouse on the night of their second anniversary was not just empty, it was heavy, pressing down on the meticulously curated furniture and the cold marble floors. Maya sat at the edge of the long dining table, bathed in the dim, golden light of a chandelier that felt more like a spotlight interrogating her isolation. She had spent the entire day trying to resurrect a ghost. She had prepared his favorite meal, breathing life and warmth into a home that had felt like a mausoleum for months. She wanted to believe that if she just tried hard enough, if she proved her devotion one more time, the man from the greenhouse would walk through the door, drop his briefcase, and look at her with that old, starving reverence. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The food had long since gone cold. Her phone vibrated against the polished stone of the table, the buzzing sound violently loud in the quiet room. It wasn't a message from Ryu. It was an alert from a high society news blog that covered the city's financial elite. Maya picked up the phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. A knot formed in her throat, thick and suffocating as she opened the notification. There he was. Ryu was photographed at the city's most exclusive winter gala, standing under a cascade of flashbulbs. He looked every inch the untouchable titan of industry, his jaw set, his eyes cold and commanding. And standing right beside him, her hand woven intimately through his arm, was a woman who was everything Maya was not. She was a prominent Korean heiress, deeply connected, impossibly thin, and entirely approved by Madam Park. In the photograph, Ryu was leaning slightly toward the heiress, offering the cameras the exact image of traditional, manicured perfection that his mother had demanded. He had chosen his empire, he had chosen his survival, and to do it, he had completely erased his wife. Maya stared at the glowing screen until the edges of the image blurred. The betrayal cut deeper than any insult he had hurled at her in the dark. He wasn't just hiding her anymore, he was replacing her. He was standing in the light with someone else while keeping her locked in the dark, convinced she was too flawed to ever leave. She set the phone down. She expected the familiar crush of panic, the desperate tears that usually followed his cruelty. She expected the voice in her head, the one he had planted there, to whisper that she deserved this, that she was too much, too big, too unworthy. But the tears didn't come. Instead, a strange, absolute stillness settled over her. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked down the long hallway into the master bathroom. She turned on the harsh overhead lights and looked at her reflection in the massive mirror. She looked at the hollows beneath her eyes. She looked at the way her shoulders hunched forward, permanently braced for a blow. She looked at a woman who had spent 2 years apologizing for the space she occupied. And then, from the deepest, most buried part of her soul, a spark caught. I am a builder, she thought, her hands gripping the edge of the marble sink. I design skyscrapers. I lay foundations that hold up thousands of tons of steel and glass. Why am I letting a man demolish me? She closed her eyes, and the memory of the greenhouse rushed back to her. She remembered the rusted iron, the shattered glass, and the absolute certainty in her own voice when she told the heir to an empire that she was the boss. She remembered the power in her own hands. Ryu hadn't broken her because she was weak. He had broken her because she was strong, and her strength had terrified him when he felt his own world collapsing. Maya opened her eyes. The hollow, weeping woman was gone. The fire had returned, burning bright and absolute. She didn't scream. She didn't throw plates against the wall or wait for him to come home so she could demand an explanation. He had spoken his truth in his absence, and she would speak hers in the same language. She walked into the massive walk-in closet and pulled out a single duffel bag. She bypassed the expensive designer items he had bought to try and mute her vibrant style. She packed only what belonged to her drafting tools, her blueprints, her architectural portfolios, and the very few personal items that tied her to the woman she had been before him. Walking back into the kitchen, she stopped at the sprawling island. She slipped the heavy diamond ring off her finger. It felt foreign now, a shackle rather than a promise. She set it gently on the counter next to her keys. She didn't leave a note. He didn't deserve her words. Maya walked out the door, stepping into the freezing night air of the city, and for the first time in a year, she took a deep, full breath. The next 2 years were a masterclass in resurrection. Maya did not just return to the architectural world, she conquered it. The pain and humiliation she had endured became a furnace, fueling a terrifying, relentless ambition. She stopped hiding. She reclaimed every inch of her presence, walking into boardrooms and construction sites with a booming voice and a brilliant, uncompromising mind. She laughed loudly. She took space. Her designs caught the attention of the city's most aggressive developers. She wasn't just drafting buildings, she was revolutionizing urban infrastructure, creating spaces that felt grounded, massive, and undeniable. She won bids that veteran architects had spent decades chasing. Her name became synonymous with structural genius and unshakable integrity. While Ryu's world was a shadowy labyrinth of hidden ledgers and syndicate paranoia, Maya's world was made of concrete, sunlight, and steel. She healed. She built a fortress out of her own success, surrounded by colleagues who respected her and friends who celebrated her warmth. Her meteoric rise culminated on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 2 years after she had walked out of the penthouse. She stood at the head of a massive, sunlit conference room in City Hall. The mayor and the municipal council had spent months searching for the perfect candidate to oversee the city's largest, most lucrative zoning and development board. They needed someone incorruptible, someone with an iron will and an architectural vision that could shape the next century of the city's skyline. They unanimously chose Maya. As she signed the final paperwork accepting her position as the Chief Director of Urban Planning, applause broke out across the room. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She had absolute authority over every major commercial waterfront development in the district. No skyscraper, no luxury complex, no massive corporate initiative could break ground without her signature. She had built her own empire, brick by brick. Miles away, in a dimly lit, heavily guarded boardroom, Ryu's empire was burning to the ground. The smell of stale coffee and panicked sweat hung thick in the air of the Park Syndicate's war room. For 2 years, Ryu had played the dutiful son, the ruthless executive, the perfect, unfeeling heir his mother had demanded. He had sacrificed his marriage, his humanity, and the only woman who had ever seen his soul, all to secure the Syndicate's future. It had all been for nothing. The federal probe had not stopped. It had mutated into a multi-agency task force. The offshore accounts his mother had promised would keep them safe were frozen. The traditional investors, spooked by the relentless heat from the authorities, had quietly pulled their backing. Madam Park, the architect of his misery, had fled to Seoul under the guise of managing overseas relations, leaving Ryu alone to face the impending collapse of their entire operation. He was cornered. The syndicate's creditors were not men who accepted apologies or filed lawsuits. They were ghosts in the criminal underworld, men who demanded their money in full or they demanded blood. Ryu stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his tie loosened, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept in weeks, his usual terrifying composure replaced by a tight, vibrating desperation. "The feds have locked down the Cayman routing," his chief financial officer said, his voice trembling as he tapped nervously on a tablet. "We have less than 72 hours before the primary debt holders realize the liquidity is gone. If we default on the main syndicate loan..." The man didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "There is one option," Ryu's lead legal counsel interjected, sliding a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the table. "The Waterfront Initiative." Ryu's eyes snapped to the portfolio. The Waterfront Initiative was the white whale of the city's real estate market, a multi-billion-dollar development project aimed at revitalizing a massive stretch of the industrial harbor. If the Park Real Estate Group secured the exclusive rights to develop the zone, the sheer volume of legitimate capital flooding into their accounts would be enough to satisfy the syndicate's creditors and clean their books completely. It was the ultimate shield. It was salvation. "We have the capital to begin construction," the lawyer continued, tapping the portfolio. "We have the labor unions lined up. We have the structural bids. The entire board is ready to move." Then what is the delay? Ryu demanded, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. Execute the contracts. We can't, the lawyer replied, swallowing hard. The city council overhauled the zoning oversight last week. Every project over $1 billion in the waterfront sector now requires the direct personal signature of the new chief director of urban planning. Without her approval, the project is dead in the water. We can't move a single piece of dirt. Ryu leaned heavily on the table, the polished wood digging into his palms. Then get me a meeting with this director. Today, offer whatever incentives are necessary. Do not take no as an answer. I already have, the lawyer said, relief briefly washing over his face. Her office confirmed a final review meeting for this afternoon at City Hall. But, sir, the lawyer hesitated. She has a reputation. She's ruthless regarding structural integrity and community impact. She doesn't take bribes. She doesn't bend to pressure. Ryu straightened up, a cold, desperate fire lighting his eyes. He didn't care about her reputation. He was Ji-hoon Park. He had spent his entire life forcing immovable objects to bend to his will. He would walk into that room, dominate the space, and extract the signature that would save his life. Prepare the car, Ryu ordered, buttoning his suit jacket with a finality that brooked no argument. I will handle the director. 3 hours later, Ryu stepped out of his armored SUV and walked up the wide marble steps of City Hall. He moved with the aggressive, predatory stride of a man walking to his execution, determined to fight his way out. He bypassed the security checkpoints with the ease of immense wealth, flanked by 2 of his most imposing lieutenants, projecting the illusion of absolute power. He was directed to the top floor, a sprawling, sunlit suite of offices that overlooked the very waterfront he was desperate to conquer. A young assistant, looking entirely unbothered by Ryu's intimidating presence, pointed him toward a set of heavy, frosted glass double doors at the end of the hall. "The director is expecting you, Mr. Park. You can go right in." Ryu nodded sharply, signaling for his lieutenants to remain in the hallway. He wanted to handle this alone. He needed the director to feel the full weight of his attention. He pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the massive corner office. The room was breathtaking, filled with natural light, drafting tables covered in sprawling blueprints, and architectural models of a city reaching for the future. Behind a massive modern desk, a leather chair was turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor. "Director," Ryu began, his voice dropping into the low, commanding octave he reserved for absolute domination. "My name is Ji-hoon Park. I am here regarding the final approval for the waterfront initiative. I believe there has been a delay in signing off on a project that will bring unprecedented capital to your district." The chair slowly turned around. The words died in his throat. The oxygen was violently ripped from the room. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he felt the impact in his teeth. Sitting behind the desk was Maya. She looked nothing like the broken, shrinking woman he had left sitting in the dark 2 years ago. She was a vision of absolute, uncompromising power. She wore a tailored emerald green suit that celebrated every curve he had once tried to hide, the rich color making her dark skin glow in the afternoon sun. Her hair was pulled back in a fierce, elegant style, and her eyes, the eyes that had once looked at him with desperate, starving love, now locked on his with the cold, unyielding calculation of a sniper. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look angry. She looked at him the way one looks at a rusted, obsolete piece of machinery. "Hello, Ji-hoon," Maya said, her voice smooth, deep, and echoing with authority. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "I read your proposal." Ryu couldn't breathe. The illusion of his power shattered instantly, leaving him standing in the center of her office, feeling entirely exposed, terrified, and small. The universe had a brutal sense of humor. The woman he'd destroyed to save his empire was now the only person on Earth who could save his life. "Maya," he breathed, the name scraping against his throat. He took a stumbling step forward, all of his boardroom strategy evaporating into a blind, desperate panic. "Maya, it's you!" "Director," she corrected him, her tone polite but laced with absolute frost. "We are in my office, Mr. Park. You will address me by my title." Ryu stopped. the reality of the situation crashing down on him. He looked at the massive stacks of blueprints, the official city seals, and the nameplate on the desk. She hadn't just survived him, she had built a kingdom right on top of his ashes. I stammered Ryu, the cold, feared head of the park syndicate, struggling to form a coherent sentence. I never thought... You rarely did, Maya interrupted, her gaze sweeping over his exhausted, desperate frame. She didn't offer a dramatic speech. She didn't need to. She picked up a heavy gold pen from her desk and tapped it lightly against the thick Waterfront Initiative portfolio resting in front of her. You are here for a signature, she stated, cutting directly to the blood of the matter. You are here because the park group is over-leveraged, under federal investigation, and facing an immediate liquidity crisis. You need this waterfront contract to legitimize your assets before your shadow investors realize you are bankrupt. Ryu's blood ran cold. She knew everything. Maya, please, he said, his voice cracking, the facade of the untouchable CEO completely breaking down. He walked up to her desk, his hands resting on the edge, leaning in with a naked, terrifying vulnerability. I know what I did to you. I know I was a monster. My mother, the pressure. I was weak. I projected it all onto you. I have regretted it every single day since you walked that door. He looked at her, searching her face for the warmth of the greenhouse, for the woman who had held him in the rain. I still love you, he whispered, the truth tearing out of him. I have nothing left. If you do not sign this, I am dead. They will kill me. Maya watched him beg. She saw the sweat on his brow, the frantic, cornered look in his eyes. For a split second, she remembered the man who had knelt in the dirt and promised to build a life with her. But that man was a ghost, and Maya was a builder who dealt in reality. She looked at the contract that would save him. She looked at the gold pen in her hand. The silence that stretched between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of the penthouse. This was the clean, bright silence of a woman who held all the cards and was in absolutely no rush to play them. Maya sat behind her massive desk, looking at the man who had systematically tried to dismantle her soul, the man who had traded her light for the cold comfort of his empire. Ryu's hands were trembling slightly where they gripped the edge of her desk. The untouchable heir to the park syndicate, the man who made backroom deals that shifted millions, was reduced to a desperate, pleading husk, entirely dependent on a single stroke of her pen. Maya looked at the Waterfront Initiative portfolio. It was a brilliant proposal, structurally sound, economically viable. It was exactly the kind of massive, city-altering project she loved to build. But she also knew the foundation it rested on. She knew the blood money that funded it, the corruption that lined its ledgers, and the rot at the center of the man presenting it. You said you loved me, Maya began, her voice low and remarkably calm. The lack of anger in her tone seemed to terrify him more than if she had screamed. You said I was the foundation, and then, when the wind blew, when your mother decided I wasn't the right aesthetic for your fragile little world, you didn't just let me go, Ji-hoon. You tried to break me. Ryu squeezed his eyes shut, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. I was terrified, he whispered. I thought if I didn't fall in line, I would lose everything. And you did, Maya stated, stating a simple, brutal fact. You just lost the most valuable thing first. She picked up the gold pen, twirling it slowly between her fingers. Ryu's eyes locked onto the pen like a starving man staring at bread. Hope, fragile and desperate, sparked in his chest. She was considering it. She was an architect. She loved to build. Maybe she would see the value of the project. Maybe she still harbored a sliver of the love they had shared in the greenhouse. I reviewed your structural designs for the Eastern Harbor, Maya said, her eyes dropping to the blueprints. They are aggressive. They demand a massive footprint. They require the city to bend entirely to your specifications, wiping out existing neighborhoods to make room for your luxury towers. We can amend them, Ryu offered quickly, his words rushing out in a frantic scramble. We can change the footprint. Whatever you want, Maya. Whatever you need to approve the permits, I will do it. You have total control. Maya stopped twirling the pen. She looked up from the blueprints, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that pinned him to the floor. The warmth he had been desperately searching for was entirely absent. In its place was the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. "I take up too much room for your world," Maya said, quietly explaining it for him. Ryu's face fell. The color drained entirely from his skin. The fragile hope in his eyes shattered, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing dread. Maya didn't sign the contract. She didn't throw it at him. She simply dropped the gold pin on the desk. The metal hit the polished wood with a sharp, final clack that echoed loudly in the silent room. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. It was the sound of an empire falling. Maya picked up her leather briefcase from the floor. She didn't look at him again. She had no more words for him, no more emotion to spend on a man who only knew how to destroy. She walked around the massive desk, her heels clicking a steady, powerful rhythm against the marble floor, moving with the fluid, grounded grace of a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. "The project is denied, Mr. Park," she said, her voice floating back to him as she reached the heavy glass doors. "Security will see you out." She didn't look back. The double doors swung shut behind her, the heavy glass sealing perfectly. Ryu stood alone in the sunlit office, the silence crashing down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He looked at the unsigned contract. He looked at the gold pen resting beside it. The federal probe, the shadow investors, the creditors, they were all coming for him, and the only shield he had left had just walked out the door. He had spent his entire life building fortresses to keep the world out, terrified of weakness, terrified of losing control. He had torn down the only real and solid thing he had ever possessed because he believed it made him vulnerable. And now, standing in the ruins of a life he had designed himself, Ji-hoon Park finally understood the absolute, devastating truth. He was made of glass, and he had just shattered. All right, I have a question for all of you listening. If you were in Maya's shoes, standing in that office with Ryu's entire life in your hands, would you have signed that contract to save him? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know what you would have done in the comments below. And if you loved Maya's incredible glow up in this story of ultimate karma, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories. I'll see you in the next one.